In the autumn of 1945, on a dock in Yokosuka, a stack of swords rose taller than the men guarding it. Some of the blades were centuries old, forged by hands that had died 400 years before Pearl Harbor was ever bombed. Others had been stamped out of factory steel just months earlier, rushed into service for a war that was already lost. Nobody could tell the difference just by looking. And that single fact was about to decide whether hundreds of thousands of irreplaceable pieces of Japanese history would survive the peace or vanish into the sea. You've probably heard the number. 500,000 samurai swords surrendered to United States Marines in the weeks after Japan fell. It sounds like the kind of fact that belongs on a trivia card. Neat, round, impressive. But the real number was never that clean. And the real story was never about Marines alone. It involves the entire machinery of an occupying army, a black market that started before the ink was dry on the surrender documents, and a handful of obsessed sword experts who quietly decided that some of Japan's oldest treasures were worth saving from their own government's orders. What actually happened to those swords will surprise you more than the myth ever could. To understand why a sword mattered so much to a defeated nation, you have to understand what it meant before the defeat. For the officer corps of Imperial Japan, the sword was never just a weapon, it was an inheritance. Bushido, the old warrior code, had been revived and weaponized by the military government throughout the 1930s and turned into propaganda that told every soldier he was the spiritual descendant of the samurai. Officers were required to carry a sword called a shingun-to, a military blade produced in the tens of thousands by arsenals in Seki and Toyama and elsewhere, and most of them machine-forged from mill steel rather than hand-hammered by a master smith. But mixed in among those mass-produced blades were something else entirely. Family heirlooms, swords forged in the workshops of legendary smiths like Masamune and Muramasa centuries before Japan ever had a navy. Officers from old samurai families had taken their ancestors' actual blades to war and fitted them into modern military mounts and carried them into combat across the Pacific. By 1945, nobody outside a small circle of specialists could tell a priceless national treasure from a wartime factory blade just by glancing at the handle. That confusion would soon become a matter of historical survival. By August of 1945, Japan's military had roughly 6 million men still under arms, spread from the home islands to Manchuria to the jungles of Southeast Asia. Every single one of them was still legally in possession of a weapon, and General Douglas MacArthur understood that an armed, humiliated nation was a nation one incident away from open rebellion. The surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd was the public ending. The disarmament that followed was the real work, and it started almost immediately. Occupation planners moved fast because they had to. The fear wasn't dramatic Hollywood resistance. It was smaller and more corrosive. Isolated attacks on occupying troops, hoarded weapons resurfacing in criminal hands, a slow bleed of instability that could undo everything the surrender had accomplished on paper. General Order No. 1, issued by MacArthur even before the formal ceremony, laid out the terms of Japanese capitulation across every theater. Buried inside that order was a directive that would eventually touch nearly every household with a military connection in Japan. All edged weapons associated with the imperial military were to be surrendered. Not just guns, not just artillery, swords. What followed was one of the largest confiscations of edged weapons in modern history, and almost nobody had a plan for what to actually do with the results. Collection points sprang up across every prefecture run by military police, from every branch of the occupying force, and not exclusively Marines. Army MP units handled much of Honshu. Marines who had landed at Sasebo and other key ports in Kyushu ran their own collection points in the zones they controlled. Navy Shore Patrol handled harbor towns. Japanese police, still technically functioning under occupation oversight, were ordered to assist in rounding up privately held blades from civilians as well, since sword ownership had never been strictly limited to active duty officers. Families who had kept ancestral blades locked away for generations suddenly faced a choice: turn the sword in and lose it forever, or hide it and risk a raid. Some buried them in gardens, some hid them inside walls. Some, in a decision that would matter enormously, later simply handed them to American servicemen personally, rather than to a faceless collection point, hoping a soldier might treat a 400-year-old blade with more respect than a government depot would. But that private handoff, soldier to soldier and family to stranger, was only the beginning of the chaos. Because the moment Japanese swords started flowing into American hands, something else started happening in parallel. Souveniring. It wasn't officially sanctioned. Technically surrendered enemy weapons were supposed to be processed and logged, and either destroyed or retained by the military. In practice, thousands of individual American servicemen homesick and adrenaline drained and standing in front of the strangest and most beautiful weapons they had ever seen simply kept them. A sword tucked into a duffel bag was far easier to smuggle home than a rifle. Officers traded cartons of cigarettes for blades. Enlisted men bought swords for a few dollars from Japanese civilians desperate for food money. By the time occupying units began rotating home in late 1945 and through 1946, an unknown but almost certainly enormous number of swords had already left Japan through unofficial channels never touching a single collection ledger. This is one of the central reasons the how many swords were surrendered question can never actually be answered with a clean number. Nobody was counting the ones that walked straight into a sea bag. Still, the official collection effort was staggering in its own right. Estimates from occupation-era records and historians and sword scholars who have spent decades trying to reconstruct the numbers range anywhere from roughly 200,000 swords collected through formal channels up to figures that stretch past 1 million once every branch and every prefecture and every category of confiscated edged weapon is included. The 500,000 figure that gets repeated online sits somewhere in the middle of that range, and it isn't necessarily wrong, but it's rarely attached to a single verifiable source. What's clear is that the scale, whatever the exact number, was enormous enough to overwhelm every storage facility the occupation government tried to use. Warehouses in Tokyo filled within weeks. Naval depots meant for ammunition ended up stacked floor to ceiling with sword blades instead. And once the initial panic of disarmament passed, occupation officials were left staring at literal mountains of steel with no coherent policy for what any of it actually was. That absence of policy is where the story takes its darkest turn. Because to the occupation bureaucracy sitting on mountains of surrendered weapons in a defeated resource-starved country, the simplest solution to a logistics nightmare was destruction. Melt it down. Dump it. Make the problem disappear. Reports from occupation-era observers describe truckloads of swords being driven to Tokyo Bay and dumped directly into the water blade after blade, sinking into the mud without a single record of what had just been lost forever. Other batches were sent to be melted for scrap steel, a resource Japan desperately needed for post-war reconstruction. From a purely administrative standpoint, it made sense. A pile of confiscated military hardware is not a museum collection. It's a liability, and liabilities get disposed of. But hidden inside those piles were blades signed by smiths whose work is now considered a Japanese national treasure. 600-year-old steel folded thousands of times by hand, headed for a furnace or the floor of a harbor indistinguishable in a truck bed from a machine-stamped wartime gun tow worth almost nothing. Somebody had to stop it, and remarkably, somebody did. The most famous intervention came from a small circle that included an American Army officer with genuine expertise in Japanese swordsmithing working alongside Japanese sword scholars who understood exactly what was being lost. Accounts differ slightly on names and exact chronology, but the shape of the story is consistent across sword-collecting historiography. A handful of specialists petitioned occupation authorities directly arguing that indiscriminate destruction was erasing irreplaceable cultural heritage that had nothing to do with Japan's wartime military capacity. They proposed a system of inspection. Trained eyes would sort the piles blade by blade, separating mass-produced arsenal steel meant for destruction from hand-forged art swords worthy of preservation. It was slow, exhausting work done in cold warehouses stacked with thousands of blades that all had to be individually examined, often using nothing more than trained eyesight and the grain pattern of the steel and the shape of the tang beneath the handle. The results of that sorting effort quite literally saved a category of Japanese cultural history from disappearing. Thousands of blades identified as genuine art swords, some centuries old, were pulled from the destruction piles and set aside for return to Japanese ownership or museums or licensed collectors rather than the smelter or the harbor. Central to that fight was a Japanese sword scholar named Honma Junji, a man who had spent his life studying blade craftsmanship long before the war and who watched the occupation's disarmament policy with something close to horror. Honma understood better than almost anyone alive that the piles of confiscated steel filling Tokyo's warehouses contained work from smiths whose names had been revered in Japan for 600 years. He petitioned occupation officials directly arguing that a sword forged in the 1400s by a master smith had nothing to do with the fascist militarism the occupation was trying to dismantle, and that destroying it was closer to burning a painting than disarming a soldier. His campaign eventually helped establish a formal society for the preservation of Japanese art swords, an organization that still exists today, and it directly shaped how occupation authorities began treating antique blades differently from mass-produced military hardware. Not every treasure was so lucky, and one disappearance from this exact period is still considered one of the great unsolved losses in the history of Japanese swordsmithing. In December of 1945, the Tokugawa family descendants of the shoguns who had ruled Japan for over 2.5 centuries surrendered a blade known as the Honjo Masamune to a local Japanese police station in compliance with the disarmament order. The sword was not just old, it was considered one of the finest works ever produced by Masamune, the most legendary swordsmith in Japanese history, a blade so significant it had been designated a national treasure and used for generations as a symbol of Tokugawa authority itself. From the police station, the sword was passed up the chain to a nearby American military unit for processing as required under occupation procedure, and then it vanished. Records show it was received by an American sergeant attached to a nearby unit, but from that point forward, no museum and no auction house and no private collection anywhere in the world has ever surfaced a blade that can be confirmed as the Honjo Masamune. It may have been melted down by someone who had no idea what they were destroying. It may be sitting unrecognized in a house somewhere in the United States, wrapped in a closet the way thousands of other bring-back swords sat forgotten for decades. Japanese sword scholars still actively search for it today, and its disappearance remains one of the clearest examples of exactly what was being lost in the chaos of that single winter. The Honjo Masamune wasn't alone. Several other blades tied to the Tokugawa family and other historic clans vanished through the exact same process that same winter surrendered in good faith to a system that had no framework yet for recognizing what it was actually handling. It's one of the strangest ironies of the entire disarmament effort. The very procedure designed to prevent Japan from rearming ended up erasing pieces of Japanese royal and samurai history that had survived civil wars and earthquakes and even the firebombing of Tokyo itself, only to disappear in a matter of weeks once handed over through the proper channels. Compare that to the blades saved by souveniring the ones individual soldiers tucked away against regulations, and a bitter kind of irony emerges. In many documented cases, breaking the rules preserved history, while following them destroyed it. Starting in the late 1940s and formalized through the 1950s, Japan implemented a licensing and registration system for antique blades, requiring swords deemed to have artistic or historical value to be registered with the government rather than treated as ordinary weapons. That legal framework exists in Japan to this day, and it exists directly because of the crisis created by the 1945 disarmament and the desperate effort to sort treasure from trash before it was too late. But sorting saved only a fraction of what was collected, and it did nothing at all for the swords that had already left Japan in duffel bags months earlier. Those blades were now scattered across the United States, arriving in the hands of veterans who often had no idea what they actually owned. A returning serviceman might hang a genuine antique katana on a den wall next to a fishing rod, never suspecting the blade beneath the handle wrap was older than the United States itself. For decades, American sword shows and pawn shops and estate sales became an unlikely secondary market where forgotten treasures resurfaced. Sword appraisers still describe the phenomenon today. A family clearing out a deceased grandfather's attic, finding a rusted blade wrapped in an old army blanket, having no idea whether they're holding a $5 souvenir or a piece signed by a smith whose other surviving works sit in Japanese museums. Some of the most significant sword discoveries of the late 20th century came exactly this way, not through any official archive, but through a stranger deciding to get an old attic find appraised almost as an afterthought. And this is where the myth of the clean 500,000 number completely falls apart, because the true total will likely never be known. Formal occupation collection points logged what passed through their doors, but that figure never accounted for swords souvenired before collection or swords hidden by families and never surrendered at all, or swords destroyed without documentation in Tokyo Bay or in scrap furnaces, or swords that changed hands in unofficial soldier-to-civilian trades that left no paper trail whatsoever. Historians who specialize in Japanese swords generally treat any single confident number with real suspicion, because the disarmament wasn't one event. It was a chaotic overlapping series of confiscations and thefts and rescues and destructions happening simultaneously across an entire defeated nation for well over a year. What the Marines specifically collected in their assigned zones was only ever a slice of a much larger picture folded over time into a simplified headline that strips out everything that actually made the story remarkable. The legacy of that chaotic year still shapes the world of Japanese swords today on both sides of the Pacific. In Japan, the registration system born from the crisis remains one of the strictest cultural preservation frameworks for edged weapons anywhere in the world, requiring documentation for any blade considered to hold historical or artistic merit. In the United States, an entire hobbyist and academic community has grown up around identifying and authenticating and preserving so-called bring-back swords blades that made the journey home in a veteran's sea bag and are only now, generations later, being properly researched and understood. Auction houses that specialize in Japanese arms regularly handle blades with documented World War II bring-back provenance, some fetching prices that would have stunned the young soldier who traded a carton of cigarettes for one on a dock in 1945. Museums in both countries now hold pieces that survived only because a handful of people in cold occupation warehouses refused to treat every confiscated blade as identical scrap. Television appraisal shows have leaned into exactly this phenomenon for decades because the reveal never gets old. A veteran's grandchild walks in with a rusted, forgotten blade, expecting to hear it's worth the price of a nice dinner, and instead learns they've been storing a piece of samurai history in a closet since 1946. Sword clubs across the United States, many of them founded by collectors who started with a single family bring-back, now run their own authentication networks, cross-referencing tang signatures and forging patterns and regional smithing styles against records that in some cases stretch back further than the country doing the researching. It's a strange kind of historical rescue mission playing out one attic at a time, more than 75 years after the swords first crossed the Pacific in the bottom of a duffel bag. What makes this story so much more compelling than the tidy trivia version is exactly the part that resists a clean headline. It wasn't 500,000 swords surrendered to Marines. It was millions of individual decisions made by exhausted soldiers and frightened families and overwhelmed bureaucrats, and a handful of stubborn experts who thought history was worth the extra effort, all happening at once in the wreckage of a collapsed empire. Some blades ended up at the bottom of Tokyo Bay. Some ended up melted into post-war rebar. Some ended up in glass cases in Japanese museums, specifically because someone fought to save them. And some are still out there right now, hanging quietly in a garage or an attic somewhere in America, waiting for someone to finally ask what they're actually looking at. No! So the next time you hear a number thrown around like it's settled history, remember what actually happened in the winter of 1945. The real total was never counted because the real story was too big and too chaotic and too human to fit inside a single figure. If a story like this is the kind of history you want more of, buried decisions and forgotten warehouses and the strange afterlife of the tools of war, this channel exists for exactly that. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because the next hidden surrender might be sitting in someone's attic right now and they don't even know it.